The passage then must be rendered, quote, "and when they had chosen elders," unquote. As a last resource, however, our opponents contend that the choice in question was the choice of Paul and Barnabas, not of the churches over which these elders were ordained. But why may not the whole ceremony be regarded as the joint act of the apostles and the people choosing the elders, the apostles confirming their choice by conferring ordination on the objects of it? There is surely something decidedly improbable in the idea that Paul and Barnabas would of their own authority select individuals for the eldership with whom they must have had scanty personal intercourse. There is no improbability, however, that in such circumstances they would defer to the voice of the people. They are here, accordingly, said to choose elders, insomuch as they presided over and confirmed their election, just as the Roman historian Livy sometimes tells us that the Roman consuls appointed their successors in office, though the world knows that they merely presided over their election by the people. Just as it is said in Exodus 13, verse 15, that Moses chose the elders, who in reality were formally chosen, as we are told in Deuteronomy 1, verse 13, by the people. Number 3. That ministers in apostolic times were elected by the people is evinced from the fact that for several centuries after the Christian era, this right continued to be exercised by the latter. We do not contend that the practice of the church in these early centuries, save as it is recorded for our instruction in the inspired word, possesses the binding authority of a standard rule for the church of every age. In quoting, therefore, from Christian writers of those times, we do not elevate them to the rank of supreme umpires in ecclesiastical controversy, judges of the last resort in all questions affecting the doctrine and polity of the church. We leave such a course to be pursued by papists and by sectarians of a recent school who would be papists, if they had manliness enough to avow the consequences to which their principles fairly lead them. Nor, however, must we be deterred by the perversion of ecclesiastical history to erroneous ends from availing ourselves of its aid in determining the customs which prevailed in the earliest times of the church. If the election of ministers can be shown to have been in the hands of the people for 6 or 7 centuries after Christianity had quitted the confines of Palestine, a presumption seemingly resistless is established in the confirmation of the previous argument from Scripture in support of the popular right. If this right was not enjoyed in apostolic times, how are we to account for its early introduction in the economy of the church? Must we suppose that it originated in an act of insubordination in primitive times and was exercised in contravention of all ecclesiastical, perhaps even of apostolic authority? It is believed that no one could seriously entertain such an opinion. No one ever has expressed it. There is one circumstance, too, which imparts augmented value to any argument in favor of the popular right from the practice of the church in the early times to which we advert. The commencement of the mystery of iniquity was manifest as much in the deviation of church government from the simplicity of the apostolic model as in the corruptions of scriptural doctrine. Among the features of Antichrist disclosed to us in the prophetic intimations of Paul, pride receives marked prominence. Lust for ascendancy was the germ of all those innovations on the liberty of the church, of which the full-blown expansion was visible when Europe, benighted with superstition, ratified the claim of the Pope to infallible and universal supremacy. This desire of ecclesiastical domination was soon manifested. The unscriptural distinction between the laity and the clergy was established in the course of the 2nd century, and here a footnote, Gibbon, number 1, 291, Jones edition. The cautions tendered by the apostle against a lordship over Christ's heritage obviously imply a nascent spirit of domination which required to be curbed, or rather destroyed. Yet the right of the people to appoint their ministers withstood for ages the swelling tide of clerical ambition and encroachment. The privileges of the people were gradually subverted, whilst the clergy were aggrandized at their expense. The popular election of ministers remained, and the right of the people was only overlooked in certain instances so as to prove that they were exceptions from a general rule. It must have rested, therefore, on a strong basis of divine warrant and prescription when ambitious ecclesiastics, engaged in a systematic course of aggression on popular privileges, refrained from intermeddling with it. The fact, however, on which this inference is founded has been disputed. It has been denied that in the first centuries the people chose their pastors, hence the necessity of producing some authorities in corroboration of the statement. We might quote the testimonies of Episcopalian writers, inimical generally to popular privilege, and therefore unbiased authorities for the fact asserted. Lowth, Milner, Wall, Andrews, Bingham, Bilson, and Field, all men of eminence and learning, some of them dignitaries of the Anglican Church, are explicit on the point, whilst Bellarmine and Father Paul, in connection with the Romish Church, confess distinctly that the people enjoyed this right in the first 3 centuries. To proceed at once to the Fathers, Ignatius, who suffered martyrdom in year 107, tells the church at Philadelphia, quote, "It becomes you as the church of God to choose a bishop," unquote. Cyprian in the 3rd century declares, quote, "That is a just and legitimate ordination, which shall have been approved by the judgment and suffrage of all, both clergy and people," unquote. Epistle 68. Ambrose, in the 4th century, addressing the people with reference to his appointment by them, says, quote, "Ye are my fathers, who chose me to be bishop," unquote. Chrysostom, as we have already stated, affirms the right of the people to choose their ministers in commenting on the 1st chapter of Acts. Leo the Great, in the 4th century, declares, quote, "Let him who is over all be chosen by all," unquote. The decrees of ancient councils might be quoted to the same effect. The famous Council of Nicaea in year 325 thus ordains in an epistle to the church at Alexandria, quote, "On the death of a president of a church, let such as have been previously admitted into orders succeed in the room of the deceased, provided they both appear to be worthy, and the people shall have chosen them," unquote. The Council of Constantinople ordained Nectarus, quote, "Cuncta der Senede civitate," unquote. Quote, "all the people giving their suffrage for it," unquote. Instances are recorded in which the people, standing upon their privileges, elected individuals in opposition to bishops, who sought to influence their suffrages in favor of other candidates. Finally, when a tendency to flood the church with an illiterate clergy is imputed to popular election, we deem it enough to present in reply the following list of illustrious fathers whose services to the cause of Christianity were all secured to the church through the instrumentality of the people: Ambrose, Athanasius, Chrysostom, and Augustine. And here a footnote. See Cowie's letters on patronage and Bingham's Origines. Number 4. The right of the people to elect their ministers is sanctioned by the practice of the church in its best times. In the primitive age, we have seen, this right was fully acknowledged. Reference might be made to the confessions of various Reformed churches, an illustration of the deference which they paid to the voice of the people in the election of ministers. The confessions of the Church of Helvetia, Bohemia, Belgium, and Saxony might be instanced as assigning the right of choice to the people. And here a footnote. Had our limits permitted, we might have quoted statements from the confessions of various churches and also from the writings of the reformers of the 17th century for the purpose of enriching our pages with testimonies in favor of the right of the people, given by men whose piety and learning must ever command respect. We can only refer the reader to Curry's Jus Populi, etc., and Cunningham's Defense of the Rights of the Christian People for an ample and masterly discussion of these topics. We have already alluded to the opinions on this point entertained by the Reformers who drew up the first and second books of discipline for the Scottish Kirk. During the period of the Second Reformation, no departure from the sound principles held and advocated by the Reformers of the preceding century took place. Assertions to the contrary have indeed been made, but the sole difference between the Reformers of the 16th and those of the 17th century seems to have been simply the difference between men contenting themselves under the pressure of circumstances which they could not control, with the clear assertion of a great principle, and men like the Reformers of 1638, in happier times, intent upon the contrivance and adjustment of a plan by which the same great principle might be not only embodied in the standards, but exemplified in the practice of the Church. Let us endeavor to condense into a short space the views of our reforming ancestors between 1638 and 1649, the golden age of Scottish Presbytery, with reference to the appointment of ministers. First of all, then, perfect unanimity prevailed amongst them in condemning patronage. Their minds were not deadened to all conviction of its evil nature from a long familiarity with the system. The act in which it was abolished by Parliament in 1649 may be deemed a fair representation of the views of the reformers of that period, and in that act patronage is denounced as unwarranted by Scripture and as a popish custom introduced into the Church in superstitious times. To illustrate the connection between the views of the Church and the civil enactment in question, we may state that the Church, 8 days before the latter was passed, transmitted to Parliament a document designed to show the sinfulness of patronages. One principle asserted strenuously in that document is that the appointment of ministers is confined in Scripture to presbytery and people, quote, and therefore patronages and presentations of kirks are sinful and unlawful, unquote. And here a footnote, that from McCree's Evidence, page 360. Secondly, the Reformers, in the times of which we speak, held almost unanimously that the free consent of the people was essential to the right constitution of the pastoral tie. It is true that Calderwood, in 1649, among other eccentric opinions which the infirmities of old age generated in his singular erudite mind, contended for the power of the presbytery to exercise an initiative in appointing ministers, but at the same time he allowed the majority of the people to dissent, according to the Second Book of Discipline, which forbids the intrusion of an unacceptable presentee. In the directory drawn up by the Assembly in 1649, by which the admission of ministers was to be ruled, the right of nomination was assigned to the session, whilst the people were left at liberty to dissent, with this provision implied, that the dissent of the major part of them was conclusive against the settlement. But further, the consent of the congregation then required as essential to the constitution of the pastoral relationship was equivalent, in reality to popular election. Bailey states that the plan adopted in the Assembly and detailed in the Directory of 1649 was the suggestion of Gillespie, who held that the direction belonged to the presbytery, the election to dissession, and free consent to the people in the appointment of a minister. This view was approved of by most of the Assembly, though some wished that the ministers should be appointed by the immediate election of the people, the right of examination, of course, being always retained by the presbytery. If then the Assembly in the end adopted the non-intrusion scheme of Gillespie, the following quotation from his Miscellany Questions affords evidence that the consent of the congregation for which he contended was tantamount to choice. Quote, "Unless the people," says he, "have somewhat more than liberty of objecting, they shall have no privilege or liberty but that which is common to strangers as well as to them," unquote. And again, quote, "though nothing be objected against the man's doctrine," he is speaking of a person proposed to a congregation as their minister, "yet if the people desire another, better, or as well qualified, by whom they find themselves more edified than by the other, that is a reason sufficient, if a reason must be given at all," unquote. It is quite evident that if a congregation on such a ground may set aside a presentee nominated by a session, they enjoy in substance the right of electing their ministers.